tenemos el honor de tener una Masterclass que promete ser realmente inspiradora e informativa. Es un honor presentarles la sesión titulada Análisis de la biomecánica en la carrera, presentada por Round 3D y HCG. Los dejo con Ken Hoye.
Thank you. We are going to try and keep you awake because I know you've just eaten. So we're going to do a live demonstration of the Run 3D system. But first, we just do a brief introduction as to what Run 3D is and how it came about. So on the first slide, so Run 3D was founded in 2012. Born out of Oxford University. So Dr. Jessica Bruce, seen on this picture, did her engineering degree at Oxford. And after achieving a first-class degree, she decided she didn't really want to lead. So pursued a PhD. And obviously, as a keen runner, she decided that what better to do than to combine her passion for running with some biomechanics. It's pictured here at the Oxford Gate Lab. And while she was studying, almost everyone who came in to do the study said, this is really, really good fun and really interesting. And how can I send my friends in to do this? Where is this available? And her answer was really, it's not available anywhere just yet. And that set her off on the idea of creating something that we could put into clinics, mostly in physiotherapy or podiatry clinics. So we could use this to help people with injuries and to improve performance. Obviously, there's some stumbling blocks to do this. Not everyone has a nice big gate lab with force plates and lots of cameras, or as much space for their clinics. So the first challenge was to condense this down. And the second challenge, obviously, is not everyone has a PhD in biomechanics. So we had to make it really easy to use for people like myself, a sports scientist, or for podiatrists and physiotherapists. And we decided to make it fit into, obviously, a normal size clinic room. So one of the ways we could do that, to condense it down, is to use a treadmill and do all of our data on a small amount of space. And there's a few adaptations we had to make to do this. So once she had this idea, she spent a lot of time going through what we needed to do and how we would get to do it. And she consulted with clinicians in various areas so that we could get exactly what they wanted and put it into practice. And eventually, around this time, there was lots of study on gait retraining. And to do gait retraining, we wanted live data. So one of the things when you're doing the studies, sometimes it takes a little while to process. And that's not really viable in clinical practice. So if you're a high-level marathon runner, for example, when I did some studies with Saucony in Boston, we did some testing on some new shoes. And after we did the testing, I said to them, well, what does it say? And the head technician said, well, it will take about 2 weeks to get the data back, and then we'll find out. And obviously, for a marathon runner, they could run 300 kilometers in that time, obviously either making the injury worse if they have one or losing time to help prevent any issues. So after this time, we eventually made the system that you will see in a moment, where we have real-time data. And it's essentially the system we still use today with a few minor adaptations. So Run 3D was founded in 2012, and in 2017, we arrived at this point with almost everything that the clinicians wanted, provided it was viable and easy enough to do. I'm going to skip a few slides to keep people awake. So then we got here, we have a 3-camera system, as you can see, and we black boxed all the processing. So it allows us to process things really fast and eliminates one of the layers that prevents the clinicians to being able to use the system. And to do that, we have to obviously have a set protocol and a set cluster system. So we can have an immediate report. So that instead of waiting these 2 weeks, we can literally say straight away, as we'll do shortly. And we wanted to get the assessment time down to 30 minutes as well. So obviously the clinician's time is also valuable, to make it as short as possible to get a good capture. In some cases, we'll do multiple reports, so we'll have a little bit longer. My boss in the clinic I used likes to do lots of different orthoses or different shoes. So maybe we'll leave a little bit longer if we're doing more than a couple of tests. And then we've also added an MSK assessment to the biomechanics. So we have measures of strength and flexibility, and also some neuromotor control measures. So we can have a look at what's happening across a variety of different modalities. And then we wanted to make the report as easy as possible too. I know lots of people in this room love a kinematic curve or a nice piece of data, but for some clinicians, that was more difficult to read. So we've had to adjust that both for the client, the clinician, and then get all of the data that we need to be really accurate. And the data we present is all based on the scientific literature on the points that we need that are associated with various injuries. So designed around runners, though we also do walking testing, and actually Walk 3D will be released next week. But this one is based around running, although we still see people from other sports. We've seen many professional footballers or soccer players, as well as other sports involved across the wide spectrum. So that's all the slides for a few minutes. We may come back to some a bit later if I go far too fast, but we shall try and make it a bit more interactive and a bit more interesting. If there are questions as we go through, just shout, but we're going to get our patient or our client out. We're going to show you how we set her up, and then we're going to take some data, and then we'll look through it and hopefully tell you what's going on. We don't want to give her too much of a complex by telling her everything that's wrong just at the moment, but we'll try and give her some good points as well. Okay, is that one working? Okay, so just as you can see, we've already marked up our patient, and we have here a selection of markers. Because we use less cameras, all of the cameras are behind the patient. So do you want to just spin around for me? So all of the markers must be viewed by all three cameras, obviously. And so we use a certain cluster system. And essentially, we have a cluster either side of each of the joints. So a shoe cluster that we attach directly to the shoes, one on the calf, one on the hamstring, and one on the pelvis. And then also anatomical markers on the ankles and on the knees. And the pelvis marker is also an anatomical marker. We have a couple more that we put on for the static measure that we've then taken off so that they can run. Obviously, because the front of the pelvis is a little bit outside of the vision of our cameras, we use a stick or dots on a stick, but we can show you those a little later. So once we set the patient up, we can pop her straight on the treadmill. Do you want to show the software? So we've put our patient in already. I think she should be, yeah, go back and forward again. You want to just go back one stage and then use the same one. Okay, so we should have a person. Yeah, move forward a little. Excellent. Love it when the software is not working. Okay, looks pretty good. Okay, you can start. We have a set capture time on the top left corner there. So we use a 30-second capture. Obviously, in a runner, they'll be running around 160 to 180 steps. So we'll get 80 to 90 steps in that amount of time. It is adjustable. So maybe if we have a subject that's very old or very young, we might adjust that down. But normally it's a 30-second capture time. Then we have a running speed selector. And we have everything from 10 minutes down to 6:30 for the ladies and 6-minute miles for the men, and a walking speed as well. So this is all based on, we're going to compare the data of our subject to an uninjured control group. And the control group we used was a very tight set of people. They had to be running at least 20 miles a week and had no injuries for 2 years. And as you probably know, runners get injured quite a lot. So that was quite difficult, and obviously no lower limb surgery, so we didn't have any gait issues that we had to accommodate. So we're going to compare this data in a moment. Are you ready to run? Yeah, we're good. So we'll get her running. So Jennifer's going to run for us. Apparently the scientific data suggests we have a 4-minute warm-up time, but we might skip that for today. And obviously some of the people we see in clinic can't run that far because they're coming back from an injury. So once we're ready to go, we can capture. Yeah, we're capturing already, brilliant. Sorry, capture, not retrain. One disappeared. So we go to, wait, what? Okay, she's good at running. She'll be fine. So yeah, back to the other screen if we can. That's what we love about it, live data. So we're going to want to just pause there a moment, and we'll get you going in a sec. We do have a fatigue protocol which runs for half an hour, but apparently Jennifer wasn't up for this today, and we measure them at the start, and then we measure them towards the end of that time to see the changes. And apparently most of the biomechanics changes happen between 20 to 30 minutes. So we're not going to do that today, but we'll get it working again and we'll get you running. So normally a 30-second capture if we're just doing one test. And like we say, we'll then compare the data to our uninjured control group. Aside from this, often we have a lot of podiatry clinics in the UK. So often they will test with and without orthotics, or they may test in different shoes. So we all like the carbon plate shoes. If you're racing, is a lot of runners in the room, or not too many? Any runners? Yeah, no one likes running at all. Excellent. Okay, a few. So yeah, these days we have lots of fun shoe variations. Obviously, a shoe with a very high stack and a carbon plate would be very different to maybe the shoe they do a lot of their training in. Yeah, so often we'll test different shoe conditions. In fact, the clinic we use has a set of standard shoes, so we test everyone in the same ones, and then we retest in their shoe or with their orthotics, so we can see the difference. And I think for us, it allows that shorten the time that they need for recovery. So if we were making orthotic without any testing, we might say, you want to try this for 6 weeks and then come back and tell us if you think it works. Obviously, as we can test the kinematic variables, we know whether it does roughly what we want it to do right from the start. And yeah, we'll be back on in a sec. So yeah, lots of applications here. So we, like I say, walk 3D, we've changed a few of the variables, but oh, we're back on. Let's go back to running for the time being. We'll come back to walk 3D in a moment. Running. Oh, where wants to start? Okay, we're getting up to speed again. So I said I'd only get to run 2 or 3 times, so maybe a little more. Yeah. So as you can see, then we have a timing bar going across. That's obviously for our patients, so they know they're not going to be on there a long time. And we have some parameters we can see straight away. So the kind of easy stuff, the stuff your Garmin would tell you, is your cadence, your step width, vertical excursion, and overstride. And these are mostly performance variables, and ones that we can actually quite easily manipulate on our gait retraining test, which we will do in a moment. And also we do still have the kinematic curves for those that like the science, so we keep them in too. But what we'll do is take specific points out of the kinematic curves and use them to illustrate what we need from the motion. So when it's finished, you should have a little pop-up in a moment. Just take a moment and leave it. It might just take a moment to process. Good. Topic that is processing. Did you capture? You can. Obviously, we stream a lot of data, so occasionally it slows down. But I'm going to blame the other systems that are on here. Excellent. Sorry, more running. Are you okay? Short recovery time. We'll get a protein shake in a minute. Yeah. So normally, after 30 seconds, we get a pop-up which tells us what we need to know. This is the bit we skipped over before, so we selected our client, and then we put them in. We'll try one more capture on here. If not, we'll go back to the slides. Yeah. Okay, go. Fast as you can. No, only joking. Nice and easy. So normally we'll match their speed to the speed of our database. And then, like you say, for some of the high-level athletes, we've had a lot of discussions with some of the Olympians saying that even 6-minute miles pretty easy for those guys. You should see the running at 10-minute mile. It looks really strange because they don't really know how to do that. So we have tested them down to 4-minute miles. And we have quite a few people that have run. We had a couple at the Olympics this year. I know that our clinic in Holland will also have seen people in some of the team sports areas. So we test elite athletes as well as others. You can stop running. So then we have this little pop-up. We can tell whether they've had orthotics, whether it's before or after rehab, but we can select our footwear conditions. And also we can put in any notes we want. So if they weren't running at 10 minutes per mile, often we'll have someone a little bit slower, then we'd put in that time because we need to know that it's a different cadence and step width that we might see a bit later. Okay, so it replays the last capture until we start another one. So it looks like she's still running, but that's obviously not the case. And on the left-hand side, we have some white parameters and some red ones. So you can see on the graph here, this is the average from our control group. Just one white one first. And this is the mean of our database. And then one standard deviation up and down. And then it goes 2 and 3. So in most cases, we want our runner to be roughly in the middle. There's the odd exception, but largely we want them to be left and right. Left is the one on the left and right is the red one. We want them to be in that kind of gray area. We swap to a red one. If it's not, it'll be signaled up red here. And we said that she's uninjured at the moment, which is surprising with all these red dots. No, not really. And if it is red, it'll be outside of these norms. So this one, max knee flexion, she has a difference left to right. We know she's a footballer, so they don't have to necessarily be as symmetrical as a runner would be. We assume she'll stand on one leg and kick with the other, or maybe multi-talented and use both. These are just some of the things that we can manipulate. We have a much more full report afterwards, but we can manipulate these in gait retraining. So we're going to do that now, and then we'll explain the reports in the next stage. So one more run for me, please. Yeah, you okay? So her cadence was actually quite low. So what we're going to do once we get her going, we're going to select overstride on the left, so near the bottom, and take off anything else. And we're going to look at the numbers down the bottom here. So we have a cadence in the numbers. Often we'll have a screen in front of our patient. And you can do gait retraining without this technology, but it makes it way easier. So instead of saying we want you to move your pelvis 2 degrees, we can just say this marker is your pelvis, just move the dots up a little higher. So just come down a little bit for me. Obviously, these will move as we go through. Down up to this top. Yeah, so what we're going to do, you select the overstride for me on the left, and you can see cadence is 1, 2, 5. So what we're going to do at the same speed is just increase your cadence for me and turn over a little bit. Second from the bottom on the left. Right, second from the bottom. Lovely. And take the other one off, thank you. So obviously, one of the things we manipulate the most with changing her stride length. So we're now up to 143. It changes the length of the stride. So overstride's how far ahead of her midline she lands. And relax, go back to normal for me. That's it. So as it comes down, it'll change on this one as well. And if we just have a slightly longer stride without falling off the treadmill, that's good. You can see that the overstride will come up as in line with the with how she's running. Thank you. You can go back to normal. I know it's quite difficult to play with, but so obviously this is not actually what we do with this patient, but if they have a fairly high overstride, a stiff knee, we might think that's relevant to any injuries in the shin or at the knee. So we can actually play around with changing this. And there's various protocols of how many times they come into your clinic. Obviously, people coming back to you and paying you more money is always a good thing for our clinicians. And we can use this data to help them reduce their issues. So there's loads of little things we can manipulate. We can change things like pelvis position. And again, it's a little easier to do it on here than it is out in the wild. and then we'd give them some cues to practice to take home with them. Then they come back and try again. And then we'd use a faded feedback protocol. So we would reduce the amount of time they can watch the screen and see if they can still hold that position without looking at the data. And that would get less and less screen time and more internal feedback. Thank you. Okay, you can stop. She's got more to do, so we don't want to wear her out completely, as she won't get her cycling in a little while. So we're going to process the report now. So yeah, we're done on this page. So we can record on that stage, by the way. So once we get them to make the change that they want, it takes the last 30 seconds instead of the previous. So we get them to manipulate it, get them to hold that change, and then it buffers the data and gives us the feedback. So we're going to finish on here. And then to produce a report, hopefully quite straightforward, we're going to use the report tab. And we've got lots of runs on here. So we're just going to put in, let's just put in the last, that one. Yeah, that's fine. We can put two of them together. So obviously if we've got with and without orthotics, we can add those on. That just select a 630 mile one for us as well and put that on the bottom. Okay, yeah. And then we can export to PDF. So really easy, you just select the trial you want, save it as a PDF, hopefully one we can find again in a moment, and then we're going to pop it up on the screen. And you have no injuries, right? So as a clinician, we try to be nice occasionally, tell them some good things as well, because we're about to tell them all the things that are not very good. Fit the height to one page for me, please. Yeah. So we have this nice report. And it just says that it's hers. There's a nice pictures on the front because people like nice pictures. Then we have 2 pages of what we measure and why. So when they go home, they go, oh, it's great. There's a little skeleton running and I have no idea what it says. So we need to give them something they can see straight away. So go down a couple of pages for me. This just tells us a little bit about what we're measuring, how we're going to use the data. And then the next one is our traffic light system. So really easy for the patient to take home. And if the other half says, how did it go? What's going on? Green is good and red is bad. Except in this occasion, obviously. And if it's outside of the kind of ideal range we looked at earlier, it will just give you a generic, this is something you can do about it. So the obvious reason why it would be out of sync, it tells you on here. So when I first started using this, I just looked through all these, and if 4 of them said, your hips are tight, then we just look at their hips. There's a slightly deeper level, of course. So we have 2 pages of those from the pelvis down to the foot. And then this is the one that we use most. If you can fit it on 1 page for me, that would be helpful. So again, as we had on the previous screen, we have the left one is the blue triangle and the red one is the right measure. And it's the one on the right side. So we try and be really simple. And we have the pelvis, the hip, the knee, and the ankle joint. And we also measure in planes of motion. So we want to be able to see how they connect with each other. So we're going to have a quick look at this one. So as we can see on this one, we have a low pelvic tilt, which actually is present in a lot of high-level elite athletes. So although it's outside of the norms, we'll let her have that one as a good one. Excellent. And because this is slightly low, we tend to get a lower hip flexion and higher hip extension. And that's actually probably quite positive for those that want to run fast. The database is currently all distance runners. So for someone who's not regularly a long distance runner, we want to adapt our expectations very slightly and take their sport into account. Then we have, going down the sagittal plane, we have knee flexion at foot strike. And you can see a little bit of asymmetry, as we said before. With footballers, we expect a slightly stiffer on one side than the other. You kick with the right, mostly. So the left side is the stiffer side, as the bracing side. The right side obviously has more talent and more mobility. And then we come down to the ankle as well. So dorsiflexion at foot strike. And dorsiflexion max we can measure through here. So you'll notice there's some differences. So we have just taken the pelvis. Pelvic tilt we take as a mean and average through the cycle. Pelvic obliquity is kind of hip drop, which we take as a maximum because that's more relevant to the injury rate. And pelvic rotation we have at foot strike. So not all of the measures are the same. They're taken at the parts that we need them to be. So we can take out the right parameters. The gait cycles are still here and they're on the following pages. So we can look at those too if we really like our mechanics. So back down the sagittal plane, we would say still stay there for a few minutes. So her dorsiflexion of foot strike is slightly on the low side. So that would be more of a midfoot, which actually is quite positive, even though slightly different left to right. And dorsiflexion max tells us if she has enough range through the calf to move. So often if they're really tight in the calf, they have Achilles tendinopathy, plantar fasciitis, they'll have a calf component mostly, and we'll tend to see a lower dorsiflexion max. Then we'll come across to the other parameters, which we tend to refer to as control planes in the clinics. And actually, again, not too bad. Her pelvis motion is pretty good. It's fairly symmetrical, slightly on the low side, so maybe a little stiff, or maybe just very good core control. And then hip motion is, again, slightly outside of our norm. So if this was an injured person, I would be wanting to look at why the hip adduction is pretty high on the right, and why there's asymmetry in hip internal rotation as well. We do look at the knees, although it's largely a sum of the hip and the ankle. So our intervention will include one of those as we go through. And we can look at the ankle joint. We have a lot of podiatrists that use the system. And when we're putting it together, they kept asking us silly questions like, can we have this measure at the ankle? Which is why there's a lot more ankle measures than there are any others. And it's also why we can't fit a nice line down one side to separate the sagittal plane from the control planes, just because it doesn't look quite as nice if it's not a straight line. So we've got lots of foot measures. Inversion at foot strike is how far on the outside you land. Eversion max, or your pronation, is on the low side. Obviously, eversion isn't pronation for those who look at these things, but probably as close as we're measuring on here. And then we have eversion excursion. So overall, you have quite a high motion around the foot and ankle, which again, I would say in this case is probably advantageous when you're playing football, as long as she has the strength to control that motion. And then we have some timing ones as well. And eversion velocity is a little bit high, again, but it kind of is in sync with your eversion excursion. So we might want to reduce that a little bit, but I think we would probably be relatively happy with that. And then we have tibial internal rotation and medial heel whip or abductory twist if you're a clinician. And again, those would be in the normal range. So the way we would do the interpretation once we've gone over a lot of the data is we would just essentially pick out the bits that are outside of the control range, and then we'd narrow down the bits that would be associated with the issue that she has. If she's just trying to improve efficiency and reduce the risk of injury, we would try and make them a bit more symmetrical, and we would investigate why any of those weren't out of the norm. Okay, everyone's still there? All good? Okay, so one more page, a few more dots for us. So these are kind of our performance parameters. So in distance running particularly, we want a cadence, probably a little higher than this. She was obviously going nice and steady, but we won't hold that against her. But we have an average at the 10-minute mile pace. So this was probably just a little bit lower because our cadence is much lower. Step width, again, we looked at before, is just a little bit wide, but not too bad. And then we have vertical excursions a little bit high. So obviously, when we're running long distances, we don't want to lose a lot of energy going up. We want to be going forward. So a very high vertical excursion would mean she would use a little bit more energy than she has to. But again, as she's a nice volunteer, we do see if she's generating lots of power, she'll have to have a little bit of vertical excursion. So I suspect it's all that power she has, not that she's inefficient in this case. And then we also have overstride. So overstride, again, we know that if you're landing with a high overstride, particularly if you have a high dorsiflexion and a stiff knee, it will increase the vertical forces through the system, particularly those that are suffering from shin pain or knee pain. So we would want to reduce that. But her vertical, her overstride on here, as you can see, is exactly the same as our control database. So that's excellent. Then we finish on a good one. And then the other ones we have in here too are time to toe off and stance swing ratio. So if she wants to run very fast, we want that to be low. So your contact time is nice and low. So that again highlights that she's a high level athlete. And then foot progression angle is how far their feet turn outwards when they're moving. And for us, again, we don't want that to be too high. It could be too low, but generally we want it to be in the middle or a little bit lower. So apart from a slightly high step width, vertical excursion on the borderline of high, generally that's a pretty good report. With one or two imbalances we can look at a bit later. So we would then select those and test them for strength and flexibility to see if there's an issue there, if we wanted to, or we just rehab them anyway. We also give them numbers. So the numbers on here compared to our control group. And there are one or two other measures in here that we haven't put on the graphs, but mostly it's the same ones. And then for those biomechanists in here, we still have the graphs. And actually shows us here on the dorsiflexion graph that she is landing pretty much midfoot. And she also pushes off quite hard through her calves. You can see a plantar flexion in here, a little bit more on the right side than on the left. But again, essentially, we want them to follow that gray line and give us a nice smooth curves. The control curves are much more variable, so we may get a few that are a little bit off the chart there, but obviously the big movements like knee flexion should follow that path pretty well. So you're actually bending your left knee a little bit more, both in stance and in swing phase, which is interesting. Okay, so we also put a second test on here, just for fun. So normally our second test would be our intervention, so an orthotic or a different pair of shoes. But in this case, it was just one of the ones we took playing around. So we're going to skip over these ones for now. So the same things. We have our traffic light system, and then we have our dot graphs, and then we have our numbers. And then after that, we have this graph here. And we've changed now from the red and the blue to green for the original and purple for our intervention. So again, if we put in an orthotic, we can quite clearly see if it does what we want it to do, if the podiatrists know exactly what they want it to do. So we might have, in this case, if this was an orthotic, it would actually make the pelvic obliquity a little bit worse. So we probably wouldn't use it. But often, obviously, with that kind of intervention, we will get some positives and some negatives. Hopefully, we know what it would do at the foot and ankle, but it can have a knock-on effect to the hip and the pelvis. And sometimes for us, that's not a huge negative. We would say, well, these are bigger, stronger muscle groups. And if we move the stress from where the pain is, the shin or the foot, in most cases, we may use it for other things. Then we would just give them a couple of exercises to make sure that they can tolerate that change. So generally, again, we have bigger, stronger muscles a little bit higher up. So pushing a little bit of the stress somewhere else isn't necessarily a problem. And this would allow us to highlight those areas first. So then we can make sure that they're mobile enough and strong enough to tolerate the changes that we've made. Obviously, we didn't actually make huge changes, so there's not huge changes on the test here. But that's a really easy way to make a comparison, particularly with different shoes, or with and without an orthotic, we'd use quite regularly. It does give you the numbers again, and this time the numbers are compared from the first trial to the intervention trial. And then the kinematic curves are laid over the top of each other. So we can have a little look at those. And then just for fun, at the end, we put in some useful information, hopefully, about what the gait cycle is, and then a glossary of terms. So obviously some of the terms that we use might be quite technical for the general public. So it's all of that written in description and then in pictures on the report. And I've gone far too fast. We're going to have to have an extended break in a minute. So yeah, really, as simple as that. We would normally obviously set our patient up, and that takes us a few minutes, but not too long. Then we use Run 3D to basically use Tel Tracker to collect the data for us. And then once we selected those, we can come into here. Do you just go back to Run 3D again for a moment? So the other thing we have in Run 3D is we do have, if you go back one, yeah, perfect. We've added clinical exams. So there's a couple of clinical exam protocols. Just want to grab one for me at random, clinical exam one in the middle. Yeah, and then there's a couple if you go basic. So we have a few tests that you've probably seen, a lot of physios will already use. And I think one of the advantages is then we have the gait tells us how they're moving. And this will inform us whether they're moving that way because they're too stiff in a certain area, or whether they're not strong enough to maintain control of that area. Obviously, you could guess if you're an old distance runner like me, I'm going to be a little stiff here and there, but hopefully more mobile than some other people. So we would test these. We have dynamometry for strength, and then we'd have inclinometers to measure flexibility as well. Yeah, just come back out of that one for me. And then the other thing we've added just to be helpful, and again, for those that don't already have their treatment protocols, is our recommendations tab. And this will give you a selection of exercises that we can then apply to this person. And for those, maybe the podiatrists who know lots about feet and less about everything else, sorry, a bit higher up. No offense to any podiatrists in the room. We could select, say, strength, and then we could select, say, hips. And it would direct us to just the exercises that are associated with that area. So it just gives us a little bit of guidance for some of the clinicians to make it a little bit easier rather than wading through loads and loads of exercises and deciding what to give them. Obviously, after a while, we probably tend to have our favorites depending on what we see. And again, we can be really specific with our rehab protocols because it will say not only that there is a hip imbalance, we'll say it's moving too much on the left or it's not moving enough on the right. And also it will be a very specific motion like an external rotation rather than just somewhere around the hip isn't working very well. So hopefully we'll get a faster, more complete rehab by using 1-3D. And then in addition to that, which I haven't got loaded today, we also have an app which translates it for you and gives you the most likely causes of what it sees on those dot graphs. So it will process the report again, and it will say, these are the muscle groups that we think are not strong enough, and these are the ones that we think are a little bit tight. So we recently have some tests in some gyms, and what we just process it through here and go, these are the areas you need to look at. We can strengthen the ones that need strengthening, and we can mobilize the ones that are a little bit tight. So it makes it really easy. Hopefully, they'll spend a little bit of time learning the finer detail so they can be really specific as to their interventions. But we also can make it as easy as possible so that you don't have to be highly qualified to be able to use the system. We do need good marker placement on the anatomical positions, but once we get a good static, we'll get good results. And that's essentially most of what we need. So yeah, we'll take a couple of questions if there are any. And thank you to Jennifer, first of all. We do have a question, I think.
Well, I have two questions, if that's okay. First of all, the markers, are they like, do they have to be reflective markers like the ones that we use in biking and sort of?
Yes, yeah, they we have a couple of different marker systems actually. So I'm going to get her up again now she's sat down. So we use anatomical markers are the single markers which we place on specific points. So we have the ankle and knee markers, and then the top of the cluster on the pelvis is also an anatomical marker. And then we've made clusters. So I'm going to take that one off. So they're specific shapes. We have limb clusters, which have 4 dots on them, and the pelvis cluster, which obviously has 3. And the system learns to recognize these clusters. And we use this specifically because when we did a lot of the testing back in Oxford Gait Lab, they'd often kick off the ankle or the knee markers. And obviously that means we have to stop the test. We have to stick them on again. And then we have to start again. And we don't have that time in clinic to keep restarting and testing, although we do have time for the odd interruption with the tech, which we had earlier. So a cluster system just makes it a little bit more robust, a little bit easier for people to use as well, including the shoe clusters, which we developed. We used to have to do them by hand, so 4 separate markers. But just having a cluster means we can put it on as long as it's pretty much in the right place and makes it much faster. But yeah, they are all reflective markers to go with the Vicon cameras, yes.
Right. And my second question is, in the report, you know, that we have these strips with several parameters, but we have like the mid band, which was the good, I think. And then we have up and down, but we have several units. Do we have like a limit for the upper and lower limits of that?
Yes, it's done on distribution curves. So we have one standard deviation up and down is the gray area. So that obviously takes a large amount of the population. And then the graphs go 2 and 3 standard deviations. So if they are 2 or 3 standard deviations away, then it will be a fairly significant imbalance and something we would need to know about. Obviously, a separate database for men and women. And for Walk 3D that's soon to be launched, we have an older generation. So we have a similar protocol, but we're looking at things like osteoarthritis and conditions that are more likely to affect that older age group. So at the moment, they are healthy runners, no low limb surgery, under 40, I believe. And yeah, so we're looking at that kind of distribution, obviously separate male and female databases as well.
Good, thank you.
I have a question about the calculation of the data. Do you use like fixed algorithms, or is it kind of a machine learning process to improve the system by training itself?
We use, set protocols. It's not machine learning. Basically to keep the data set tight. So we do save the data as long as the patient consents. And it will go to our university partners. We have 5 university partners that use it to try and improve both the system and for various other injuries. But for this particular system, we don't want to add in lots of injured people and change the variation. So yeah, it's a tight protocol based on essentially logic gates and measurements within the within the group sets we take. So it's not evolving at the moment, though we will use some of that for other things. We do also have sheets on the measurements that we know associated with certain injuries. So, sorry, slight aside to your question. If we know that certain measurements from the data will affect certain injuries, so there are 20 variables for Achilles tendinopathy. And actually, while we're there, I had a patient the other day who came in and said, I've seen a physio and a podiatrist, and I don't expect much from this assessment. So I thought that was a good place to start. But I took it as a challenge, and we did the test, and we used the information from the biomechanics papers, and we essentially ticked off the ones that were good. And she was left with 4 measures that were not in the normal range. So although she'd already had quite a lot of physio and her pain had reduced, we were able to determine the things that she hadn't looked at and the things that she had to still work on. So yeah, we do use the data, but not directly to update the system at the moment.
Well, how do you define those parameters? I mean, why those numbers are the good ones that represent the gray part of the graph?
So the parameters that we selected were based on the data. So we needed some good quality papers to suggest that it was significant to 1 or more injuries. And then the numbers are based on the control database. So we have the mean is the center line, then 1 standard deviation up and down from our control database. Yeah. We have the ability to use another database. So we were putting together an elite athlete database. It's hard to get elite athletes that are not injured and want to come in, but we almost there with, I think it was something like 1430 for 5K for the men and 16 for the women. So really high level. And we've got almost enough to produce that database. And again, with the Walk 3D, we have a 50 plus, and we may then add a 70 plus database as well, because obviously the criteria will be slightly different. And then you'll be able to select which database you want to compare to. We were discussing a Mexican database too, right? So a little bit more local population, but not yet.
Thank you.
More questions? Feel free.
it's possible to import the data to the software, or you have to do it like in the moment.
To
Like, for example, if you
we could,
take the
in
video
theory,
and
take tracker trials. So we would measure on tracker, but because it's a specific marker set, if it doesn't read the markers, you wouldn't be able to run it. So we did have that. If we did in the early days, if Run3D did crash like we saw earlier, which it doesn't very often these days, by the way, then we would have taken a tracker trial and then we would have played it as if they were running. But we found that if we asked our clinicians to do that, often it wasn't running on Run3D because they'd done something wrong. So then it wouldn't run on the tracker data. So we could in theory, but in practice, it doesn't always translate.
At the beginning, you stated that Run3D took from 2012 to 2017 on developing the software. But what was the hardest part to develop? The part of the software itself, or the part of the sensors?
We did have a previous version, so we were using it a lot of that time. It was mostly applying the live gait retraining and how to get the data as fast. So also that development process, I think we used a previous version that was slightly less technical, maybe just got less parameters out. But we, in conversations with our clinicians, they said, surely we can do more than this. We want more measures. We wanted to do this and we wanted to do that. So it's we were using it a lot of that time, but we wanted to make it a little bit better, more efficient, and provide more data. And also the studies on gait retraining were progressing quite fast. So we also wanted to get the right parameters that we could measure on gait retraining. So it did exist before that. We didn't not use it for 5 years, but we had a more basic version, which we then upgraded, which did take a little while, but not quite that long.
Thanks.
Good question. These academics do sometimes take their time in producing something we can use.
Another question?
Complementando un poco tu pregunta, de que decías que si era más complicado el tema de los sensores, y es que ahorita las dos tecnologías que van a ver trabajan sobre Bicon. Entonces ellos son integradores. Entonces ahorita que decías lo de la idea de las plantillas, pues ustedes pueden utilizar sus laboratorios para desarrollar nueva tecnología usando digamos que plataformas que ya existen, en este caso Bicon. Entonces el software de Run3D trabaja usando esas tres cámaras y realmente ellos lo que hicieron es desarrollar un software que agarra esa información y la hace mucho más eficiente. ¿Vale?
No more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Ken. We have a gift for you.